I'm Barry Umansky, and I'm with the Digital Policy Institute. We'll talk more about our association in a minute, but it's great to be back in Murray, Kentucky, and to be part of this meeting of the minds, talking about a variety of telecommunications issues confronting government, federal and state, all kinds of industries, and of course the public. Now, my overly long bio is parked in your program. I'll spare you reading it to you right now. But the important thing is that we're part of the Digital Policy Institute, along with my colleague Bob Yaden on the far side, and I'll introduce Bob in a moment. And since our formation in 2004, we've been successful in providing research and analysis that has helped guide legislators at the state level, the federal level, regulatory bodies, in making changes that made sense in advancing telecommunications policy. I think you'll find that if you look at our track record, we've been pretty good. We've got some new ideas that we're looking at right now. And one of the new things we're doing, for the past couple of years, we've been involved with a fairly dynamic Federal Advisory Committee working under the auspices of the FCC in Washington. And I've been made the co-chair of the IP Transition Working Group, and along with Bob and other folks there, we are looking at a number of the issues that we talked about today, and in that position we also supply guidance to the Congress and to the FCC. We have a terrific panel today. Let me start it right now. On my immediate left is Hank Hultquist. Hank is Vice President for Regulatory Affairs at AT&T in Washington, D.C. He joined AT&T in 2004 and has responsibility for internet policy, broadband policy, media, voice, intercarrier compensation, and of course universal service. Prior to AT&T, he worked for MCI, and he is also involved with the North American Numbering Council. He's on that council, and also the Wireless Communications Association's international group. He's a graduate of the George Mason University Law School just outside Washington and the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and his talent in foreign service is when he ordered in an incredibly articulate fashion in his original tie at the Jasmine restaurant last night. I was quite impressed. Next we have Randy Hollis, who is the Executive Director of the Kentucky Cable Association. Many of you know Randy, of course. Prior to joining the association and heading it up, he was in cable itself and spent 15 years in the industry, with 11 years in government relations work at Mediacom, and then doing ad sales prior to that with Cablevision. I found personally interesting to find out that he spent 15 years in the radio and television business, and I used to work at radio and TV stations myself, and we had an opportunity to compare notes last night at the reception. He's a graduate of Arkansas State University. Now, we would have had over here the chief economist from the FCC, Steve Wildman. He was also supposed to be our keynote speaker today, but I think Brent did a great job in subbing. Steve is actually watching this at home. Now, because of the shutdown, he could not come here, he couldn't participate by video conferencing, but he's there, and on the count of three, I'd like us all to say hi to Steve. 1, 2, 3. Hi, Steve. Now, in your honor, we're going to do the wave. Very fortunate, we've got a terrific substitute, and it's my colleague Bob Yaden. Bob is the director of the Digital Policy Institute, and it's not the first time that Bob and I worked together. For 20 years, I was the Deputy General Counsel of the National Association of Broadcasters in Washington, and for a couple of those years, Bob took a break from academia and was the National Association of Broadcasters Vice President for Television Operations. And he learned all about and was instrumental in forming communications policy, working with people on Capitol Hill and with the agencies that are involved in broadcast regulation. And many of those skills he's using today with the DPI. Bob is, of course, the director of our institute, and he is also the creator of something called our Applied Research Institute at Ball State University. He's a graduate of Michigan State University, which we hear about all the time, up and down this, you know. And also he got his MS degree in mass communications from Oklahoma State. He teaches courses in this stuff on technology policy, business, FCC regulation and legislative change, and was one of the people who created basically Ball State University's counterpart of what Jim Kant has here, our Center for Information and Communication Sciences. Now, to get things going, I've got a series of questions. I'd like to start things off to cover the basics with our panel. And there'll be a time where you'll have your opportunity, full opportunity, to ask your questions of our panelists as well. And I want to start first with Hank Hultquist. This kind of comes off our discussion, our keynote presentation a moment ago. AT&T, not too long ago, filed a petition at the FCC, basically asking the commission to get a move on with the IP transition. And as part of that, to bless a series of trials that would take place at certain wire centers around the nation. What were the reasons that AT&T filed this petition, and how are those wire center experiments actually take place, Hank?
Thanks, Barry, and I'd like to thank the organizers of the summit for inviting me.
Well, indeed.
I guess to understand sort of what the point of it would be, Brent's presentation was actually really helpful, I thought, in, if I had a trademark on the phrase IP transition, I'm sure I could be a richer man than I am. But I think he did a good job.
I registered the URL. I'd be happy to sell it to you.
I think Brent did a good job of really explaining what it really is, and just to sort of my attempt to paraphrase Brent, I think it's a migration from narrowband circuit-oriented networking to broadband packet-oriented networking. And that's really the nature of the transition that's underway. And as Brent described, it's well underway. The challenge that presents for a company like AT&T is that AT&T built a platform. Think of it as a technology and service delivery platform for plain old telephone service, which is not a broadband packet switched service. At least it wasn't in the platform we built. And so we built that platform, and it was built around, fairly massive scale economies with expectations about certain levels of subscribership, et cetera, to make it a viable, going concern. And what's happened is that platform is dramatically descaling in terms of the number of users on it. So just to give you a sense, since 1999, in the 22 states where AT&T is a local telephone company, the number of POTS lines has declined by over 70%. So since 1999, greater than 70% decline in POTS lines. In those same states, we estimate, based on FCC data and data from other government agencies, that only about 20% of the living units, homes, apartments, et cetera, in those states actually are hooked up to any phone company's POTS service. So gives you a sense, and this isn't a stopping point. These trends will continue, in 5 years from now. Instead of being a 70% decline, it'll be closer to an 85% decline probably. So we look at that and we say, what are we going to do about this platform? It is, a platform that was built for this certain scale. As Brent suggested, much of the equipment is no longer manufactured. Spare parts are hard to come by. We have, in fact, had vendors, service vendors, come to us and tell us that they have to increase the price on our service contracts because their workers are retiring. So there are a lot of challenges, and so when we look at it, we figured out, that platform is a platform that we're going to have to sunset at some point in the future. We don't have to flash cut it, we don't have to turn it off today, but the day is coming when we will have to turn that platform completely off. And so we look at that and we go, oh my God, that is a huge challenge. We operate these services in approximately 4,700 wire centers spread across 22 states. How are we going to do this? And so we look at a challenge of that magnitude and we think, well, first we should try to do it on a smaller scale first. We should try to find some places where we could do limited geographic trials and actually figure out what it will take to sunset this platform. And once we figure that out and work it out with consumers and regulators and policymakers and other companies, what's a good plan for how much time do we need to give? What kind of notices do we have to give? What kind of other services have to be provided? What other capabilities in the successor services should be there to make sure that everybody's concerns are adequately addressed? Our hope is that we could do these trials, resolve those issues, and then ultimately that could be a template that we could take across these 4,700 wire centers. So really that's what we hope to learn through the trials, is we hope to learn what are our customers out there today, what kinds of equipment do they have that depend on that POTS platform, what opportunities do they have to move to different or new equipment, what kinds of capabilities should we make sure are in those successor services, so that both from a consumer perspective and from a public policy and public interest perspective, people will perceive that in fact this transition is going to happen and be completed in an orderly way. So that's the point. That's really what we hope to learn through the trials. We hope that the FCC will soon take us up on our offer to oversee these trials so that we can get them underway in 2014.
Yeah. Probably next month, the FCC will have a new chairman who actually cut his teeth in the cable industry. Tom Wheeler, who was the head of the Cable Association and also the Wireless Association. And he was quoted a couple of weeks ago that among his 3 top priorities as FCC chairperson would be moving things along on the IP transition. So there'll certainly be some additional filings of AT&T, our Digital Policy Institute, will also be playing a role in that process, and look for some change. Now, cable television, isn't this kind of old news to you? Randy, you've been doing internet protocol stuff for a while, right?
Yes, thank you, Barry. First of all, I want to thank Murray State University for putting this summit together, and I hope all of you are enjoying it. You heard some great sessions this morning, and I hope you'll enjoy our session this afternoon. But is this on? Can you hear everything okay? Okay, great. Well, yes, cable already does. For our members here in Kentucky, we do provide voice service. That's 14 companies. Most of all, not all of them have migrated to an IP platform, an IP network. We also provide business class services. Some of our members do using IP. And really, IP is at the heart of something you've heard quite a bit about today, and that's the broadband. That's been part of cable. So yes, we are there, and we do have definitely an interest in an IP transition. As some of the things Hank alluded to, the bottom line is we want to make sure this continues to work for the customer, because it's to all of our benefits. We do interface with each of these networks, interface with each other. It's very important that in the course of the incumbent phone companies transitioning their network over to IP, that we don't lose anything in that transition that would negatively impact the end user.
That's it. There's all kinds of voice services out there right now, many are provided by cable. How do they compare to technology-wise and functional with things like, Skype and Vonage? And then I want to go back to Hank and talk about wideband AT&T voice. Randy, first.
Well, first of all, Skype is a little different animal. Skype does ride on the public internet. When we're talking IP technology, internet protocol technology, and I'm assuming everybody in this room already knows, we're not talking about riding on the open internet. We're talking about using the IP technology. And a couple of other really important aspects here are our members in cable using IP technology. We are considered telecommunications carriers, so we are entitled to interconnect with the incumbent phone companies and things of that nature. Skype, on the other hand, is a nomadic service. You may have a phone number, you may not have a phone number. Likely does not have any obligations for E911. Our members providing voice services have that obligation, and it is a fixed service, so it's not nomadic.
Okay. What about the wideband AT&T service that was mentioned by Brent? Tell us about that, the audience.
Yeah, so that I was really pleased that Brent talked about, wideband, or I think of it as high definition audio. I mean, I think for so long, people always ask me, well, what are consumers going to get out of the IP transition? What's so great about it for them? And Brent talked about a lot of things that are in fact great, but I think an underappreciated one is the opportunity for higher quality audio. If you ever listen side by side to a recording of a telephone conversation with a recording of a high definition conversation, which you can do today on many voice over IP systems within an enterprise. It's stunning, the difference in quality. And so AT&T has announced that we will be starting to offer voice over LTE this year. By the end of the year, we'll start to roll out handsets with voice over LTE capability. And it won't be far behind that at some point, which we haven't announced a date for yet, so I won't make the news. But it won't be that far behind when voice over LTE goes high definition. And I think that will be, people for a long time, you know, I've said it myself, oh, the quality of the wired phone, you know, I really like that. Voice over LTE will end that. The quality of the wireless phone will be far superior to the quality of the wired phone at that point in time.
What we're seeing right now is the end product, or at least the route that we've been put on since the 1996 Telecommunications Act. Cable and telephone companies, they're all in the same business, delivering digital bits, as of course is, you know, television right now with its own digital transition that was completed a couple of years ago. I'm sure the students here at Murray State that are involved in telecommunications are told that regulation always follows technological change, because we all know that government abhors a legislative or regulatory vacuum. They like to fill it up. And Bob, when you were in Washington, you saw a glimmer of that push and the pull from technology affecting regulation and legislation. What are some of the lessons that we learned, you know, over the last couple of decades that apply now?
Thanks, Barry. I too want to thank Murray State for having us out here, and appreciate the opportunity as director of the Digital Policy Institute to be here with you. I also should give a shout out to Steve Wildman. I'm much better looking, but not as smart as Steve. We do share something in common. Steve is on leave from the Quello Center at Michigan State, and took the position as the chief economist, and of course I have my Spartan ties with the other MSU. So I think, Barry, that I think history provides us, I think, with enough examples of where the FCC has replaced the marketplace with its own wisdom, and not always, it's not always in an efficient manner. We remember, well, most of us here remember the attempt by the FCC to legislate AM stereo to be competitive with FM. So with AM stereo, you got 2 channels of bad audio. But with AM stereo, you also had 2 separate companies fighting it out in the marketplace, and the consumer didn't know which one was going to win. Not a good idea on behalf of the commission. So attempts by the commission to impose their view of a regulated transition solution before all the issues are known and addressed, I think probably is not a good idea. Now, let me suggest a different scenario here than the one painted with the AM stereo idea. And Barry, you made some reference to it while we were both in Washington together. We were going through this transition to high definition television. And you know, that provides us with perhaps an example. Here you had a situation where you had to go from among 23 proposals, all of them analog, and take those proposals, turn them into digital, and then boil it down to a single solution. Now, part of the answer to that was not technology itself, but was human, and that was Dick Wiley, former chairman of the FCC, who headed up the advisory committee on advanced television services. And Dick Wiley was, I think, instrumental in bringing the various groups together. And I remember the angst that went on at that particular time as we tried to get the impossible done. That was the broadcasters to agree with the cable people. And then we entered the new part of the equation, and that was the computer folks into the equation. So bringing those 3 industries together for a solution was was instrumental. And I'm going to suggest to this group today that such a solution is possible with the IP transition. But again, it's a lot better if we have the industry participate and we help, again, pull it into the marketplace and not push it.
Yeah. And what is technological compatibility, end-to-end compatibility of people involved in the IP transition and IP telecommunications themselves? Do we need federal legislation to mandate, standard setting? What do you think?
I hope not. I think the prospects for legislation are always, doubtful at best. So one of the great things about IP as a protocol is that it allows you to work, it works over all kinds of different networks and technologies. So the radio network that's used for LTE is an entirely different network than the DOCSIS network that the cable providers use, or a passive optical network that a fiber to the home provider might use, or a VDSL network that a phone company might use. So these are all different access technologies. They use very different methods of managing their resources. But IP works perfectly fine over all of them. So it's actually a remarkably flexible protocol. I think there might be a few issues, discrete issues, that where some sort of legislation might be needed. So for example, there's an appeal right now of the FCC's transformation order of universal service and intercarrier compensation. The oral argument will be later this fall in Denver. And one of the issues that's being appealed is you have some parties arguing that the FCC has no statutory authority to use universal service to support broadband. Well, that just can't be right. I mean, maybe it is right as a legal matter, but it can't be right as a policy matter. It wouldn't be good policy to say universal service can only be used to support, these POT services that are going away. So if that happens, and if the FCC were reversed on that grounds, then hopefully parties could come together and say, here's a narrow statutory fix that we need to help this transition go along. And I can't imagine anybody would oppose a fix like that.
I understand entirely. Today at lunch, at the keynote, right after lunch, Brent suggested that in almost any transition we've seen in the course of history, there have been some perils. And the issues of the IP transition, you've got people on all sides suggesting great benefits, some suggesting there may be some downsides or some significant bumps along the road. As we move toward farther into the IP transition, we're on that road right now. Hank, what are some areas where we think that capabilities should be maintained, maybe not maintained, and in what areas might we expect to see some kind of regulation governing what these systems can do during and after the transition?
Sure. So, we had a great presentation earlier today on 911, and that's clearly an area where we're going to not only maintain capabilities but add new ones. And I think that's critically important to the success of the transition, is the ability to do that. There are other areas, for instance, we saw there was in DC at least, I don't know how far the word got out, but there was this big dust-up involving Fire Island in New York, where Verizon had their plan had been damaged by Superstorm Sandy, and they were proposing to offer a wireless service as the replacement. And there were a lot of complaints that, for various reasons, but one of them was, for example, that the service didn't support faxing. And sure, I can understand that, if you depend on fax, you don't want to lose that capability overnight. But I think when you think about a multi-year transition that we all prepare for, there's no, faxing as a capability you can perfectly well perform on an IP network with scanning documents and sending them as attachments. So in the long run, it's hard for me to believe that faxing is a capability that it's going to be critically important to support forever. It may be one that we want to make sure gets handled as part of the transition, but I'm skeptical that it's a mission-critical capability that has to be supported for all time on the network.
Randy Hollis, what's the cable industry's position on the need for state and federal regulation over the course of the IP transition, and certainly after it's over, for telecom?
Well, thank you, Barry. Actually, cable's interest in this really kind of boils down to really one major point. Right now, there is oversight at the federal and state level on the, not the retail side so much as the wholesale side of the matter, the interconnection rights that were granted under the 96 Act. We want to make sure that there is still oversight in those areas. Basically competition has kind of ruled the space in the retail space, but on the wholesale side, it's a little bit different story. We want to make sure that, again, nothing can happen that can disrupt us providing service to our customers, and nothing happens to those customers either from a technological standpoint or from a financial standpoint, for that matter. So we want to make sure that we still have the gatekeepers, if you would, in place, particularly on the wholesale side, because frankly the competition is not really regulating that as it is on the retail side at this point.
Can I respond a little to that, Barry?
Yeah.
So I think that we certainly need to make sure that interconnection works in the IP world, because we can't have islands of connectivity, and we can't have, we have problems today, frankly, with, or at least allegedly problems with calls not completing in certain circumstances to rural areas. So we certainly don't want to replicate that kind of problem. I think that the challenge, that we see is that today, if you look at the Telecom Act, you've got two interconnection provisions, one of which is I would call a level playing field provision. It says 251A, it says all telecom carriers have a duty to interconnect either directly or indirectly with all others. And then there's another one that created special duties on incumbent LECs, and basically they were the only ones that were subject to those duties. I think that, you could certainly argue that made sense at a point in time when the incumbent phone companies were monopolists. I think at this point in time, I'm kind of curious, does cable favor the level playing field provision, 251A, or do they think even if the phone company, the telco share falls to 10% of the market, which it very well could by 2020, would they still think that those provisions in 251C are the right vehicle for interconnection? Certainly I would hope they would favor the level playing field provision.
Are you going to take that, Randy?
I'm not going to speak for the entire cable industry. I'm going to speak on our behalf. We think this should be a technology neutral. I mean, it's whether it's a switch service or whether it's an IP service, those provisions are still there, and we can certainly talk about anything that needs to be done to them going down the line. But as it stands right now, we think that basically throwing out any regulation without moving through this process and seeing what the fallout can be would be a little bit premature. Again, I think bottom line is we want to make sure that the customer is taken care of, and there's nothing that disrupts that customer financially or technologically.
I don't think it's a question of throwing out regulation. I think it's a question of under which statutory provision do you think the regulation should apply. And I think it is a reasonable question to think that if it is the case that in fact that you would say that even if the phone company market share is 15%, 10%, they should still be treated under the 251C. I guess I think that that's not, certainly when we think about cable regulation, the cable industry would never take such a position.
And again, I don't think that I said that. I said I think that we could look at it down the line. And I don't know, is your market share 10 or 15% now?
I think it's about 25.
Bob, could you sit in the middle, please? They say that everything old is new again.
Right.
And we now are approaching, later this year, the 100th anniversary of that Kingsbury commitment, the social compact between the phone company and the public and the government. Is there a need for a broadband social compact? What do you think, Hank? And what would the terms of that be?
So that's kind of an interesting question. So you think about the Kingsbury commitment, it really evolved into the 1934 Act, and it turned into this system of local phone monopolies, and they were supported by, rate making that was designed to create, what we called cross subsidies. So we used business lines to support lower residential rates, and we, eventually, all along we used long distance to support local, and eventually we created access charges. And so it was a social compact that was built on top of that, and so we've now really overturned that. There are no more local monopolies. Access charges are no longer, that the FCC is taking them down to the point where they're not really a source of cross-subsidy. Business lines are highly competitive, so it's unlikely that they're providing any cross-subsidy. So that old compact is certainly gone. I would say I think we should certainly be talking about what is the right vehicle to replace that, because I attended the session earlier this morning talking about the status of broadband deployment in Kentucky, and there's a lot of places that still don't have broadband. I mean, if broadband is the basic service of today, of the 21st century, we need to figure out what policies are necessary to make sure that it's deployed adequately to all citizens. So I think that is a topic very worthy of discussion. I think we should be figuring out where is broadband not deployed, what are the costs to bring it there, and what are the right kinds of programs to make it happen. So I would say, yeah, let's get on with that job rather than, arguing about the same things we've been arguing about for the last 10 years.
Yeah. Bob Yaden, we've witnessed in Washington several meetings of this government advisory committee that we sit on. Some people who are very afraid of future regulatory change, afraid of technology. Certain groups seem to be putting potholes in front of the transition to broadband and state-of-the-art technology. How would you characterize some of the opposition there, Bob, and what do you think the counter-arguments are?
Well, that's interesting. You're right. We have seen various groups who want to oppose any movement forward by this industry. And I think that, the Digital Policy Institute, similar to TSM, we are social scientists who I think that in looking at problems like this, we aren't going to offer solutions until we have had a chance to investigate what's involved here, to identify, I think, the issues and study the impact on the consumer, impact on the industry, et cetera. So it's for these reasons, I think, that we at the Digital Policy Institute filed reply comments in favor of AT&T's proposal for trials, and that we have a chance to actually investigate, look at, study what's involved in the transition, and come up with some workable solutions. And so, again, I think that's the way we need to move forward.
In talking with Steve Wildman before we had the government shutdown, we were planning this conference. And Steve is one of the main players in something at the FCC called the Technology Transitions Task Force. And we were going over, what that task force has been assigned to do. And they've identified 3 specific areas for primary focus of the Technology Transmissions Task Force. And they were, number 1, the transition from copper to fiber in wireline networks. Number 2, to IP for routing messages from networks generally. And then the shift of a substantial fraction of traffic from wireline to wireless networks. Why are those 3 areas of focus of the Technology Transition Task Force important? And are there other transitions we haven't talked about today, but should be part of that dialogue? Frank, what do you think?
Well, I think they're important. They're kind of manifestations of different sides of a same phenomenon, and it was really the phenomenon Brent talked about earlier, and that is, why are we making this movement from these networks that use circuit orientation where they would establish, some connectivity and then reserve it for the entire length of the session between the two endpoints. We called it a call. Why are we moving from that to this packet approach that chops everything up into a million pieces and sends it out and it all magically is put back together? And so this is interesting. I was reading, back when the internet was being developed, one of the leading engineers at the time wrote this thing, and it really stuck with me. He said, in effect, you've got two variables. One is processing and the other is transmission. And when processing is expensive relative to transmission, use circuit switching. When processing is cheap relative to transmission, use packet switching. And I think that's what's happened. Moore's law has made processing incredibly cheap over time as compared to what it was at the time that this guy was writing, which was in the late 1960s. Meanwhile, there is no Moore's law equivalent when it comes to digging ditches. The cost of digging ditches is the cost of digging ditches. And so that's driving this. And the other thing on the wireline to wireless, it's really a move to personal communications. I mean, we all, at least if you're my age, you grew up in a house where there was a phone tacked to the wall, and if you were lucky, there was an extension upstairs. We didn't have that till I was about 10 or 12 years old. And you got a long cord. That was how you got mobility. You got one of these long cords that you could stretch out. That doesn't fly anymore. I mean, Brent was talking about his kids. Mine are 7 and 9, so I'm sure this day is coming soon. The expectation today is for personal communication to the person, and so that means you have to be mobile. It means wireless. Even if you have a wireline connection, it means Wi-Fi. And increasingly, we're going to move seamlessly between macro cell, micro cell, distributed antenna, Wi-Fi. We're going to move seamlessly across those things. Just briefly on the copper to fiber transition. I mean, this is a spectrum. It's not a binary thing. It's not like we're saying no more copper. Last year when AT&T filed its petition asking the FCC to oversee these trials, on the same day we announced a major investment plan, which we called Project VIP. Mm-hmm. And on the wireline side, to summarize, what you could see Project VIP is saying is, we think in any place where we can get a reasonable return on sufficient investment to reduce the copper length to 12,000 feet or less, if we can get that copper length down to 12,000 feet or less, ideally 5,000 feet or less, but at least 12,000 or less, we think we can have something that's relevant in the marketplace. If the copper length is more than 12,000 feet, we don't see that as having a competitively relevant future. And to me, that's kind of, right now, that's where it is. A few years from now, maybe that 12,000 is going to come down shorter and shorter, and eventually it'll be all fiber.
We've covered a fair amount of territory. I think we've covered most of the basics. Randy, you have any comments to add?
No, I think I would actually agree with Hank on just about everything he just said there. We are going into we're in an IP world. Whether, as you said, some folks were maybe dragging their feet a little bit, Bob, but whether they want to or not, that's where we are. I would venture to say that every one of you in the audience probably has a smartphone in your pocket. You may be carrying an iPad or the Android equivalent. You're going to go home tonight, you're going to watch your digital cable services, or you're provided by hopefully one of our members, but maybe from AT&T for that matter. But all of this has become possible because of where we are. I mean, we're living at a very wonderful time. Some of us are going through a transition. We're all going to get there. There may be some different roads to get there, and we'll be talking about those as we move in that direction. But at the end of the day, everything that we have, we can be very grateful for. There's a lot that happens on the back end, and that's what we're all here talking about, is the back end. The average customer out there, all they're really looking at is when they pick up that phone, or when they get on their iPad, or when they go home and they turn on the TV, does it work, and can I afford it? And we want to make sure that they can answer yes to both of those. Bob.
First off, to add to what Hank said, that, even with the consumer, which is obviously, Barry and I sit on the CAC, the Consumer Advisory Committee, something that we're interested in, and that's where we hear a lot of these complaints, and most of it, I think you could put in one category: fear. They don't understand it, they don't understand the transition, and they don't know what the impact is going to be, which, some of that is understandable. But to add into what Hank said, even in the wireline households today, they're wireless. That wireline terminates at a wireless device that they carry around the house, a 600, 900 megahertz device that within the household it's wireless. So, not cellular, but wireless. And so, it's about mobility for the consumer. And that's really where we've gone. And you don't have to ask the consumer. The consumer has already voted. The numbers you mentioned, Hank, have already demonstrated they voted. They're not interested in more wireline connections. They're more interested in switching to mobility. And the better the mobility and the faster and capacity that they can have, which causes additional problems beyond this panel. But we'll have to move to the spectrum auction panel next. And then the final thing is the Kingsbury commitment. I wanted to say about that. Not that I'm old enough to, Hank, but that is really the kind of the birth of the universal service commitment. Came out of the Kingsbury era, and that compact, of course, got shattered. Especially in 1982, when the government and Congress, et cetera, decided it was time to break up the Bell system. Yeah. So how is it replaced? I think you're absolutely right. There has to be something new to replace it in a new environment, which kind of lays the entire fabric on the table for us to have an open discussion about what is it we want to do and what type of service do we want this new IP environment to have.
Speaking of mobility, we have a mobile wireless microphone that can roam this room and take questions from the audience, and it's now that time for you to ask any questions you have of our astute panelists. Brent.
Let me just say, first of all, how much better my life would have been as a kid while trying to listen to my Cardinals games on the transistor radio if I had had AM stereo. Would have been so much happier. But I think you mentioned average consumer and working our network for the average consumer, and I wonder how much planning is involved in building out the network based on the average consumer, which is completely changing. If I'm average for my age group at 44, my kids are a completely different age group that are going to be paying for phone service in 5-6 years, and they want totally different stuff than I'll settle for. So how much different is the network planning based on what the average consumer is becoming based on what it already is?
So it's interesting. I think, we see these trends, happening, and you can see them demographically much more accentuated. I mean, the younger generation is moving away from telephony toward texting and chat and those kinds of applications as their main modes of communication. No reason to think that'll slow down. That'll probably accelerate. Puts different kinds of, from a business, the thing I think is the most interesting is the business model. And you can look at it, it's interesting because we have both phone and cable here. You can look at it from the phone side. We see access lines, declining 10 to 15% year over year, year after year after year. And it's just this brutal reduction in access lines, I think I heard one of our executives say at some point he just stopped looking at the switched access line loss. It was too depressing. And then there's a lot of talk about whether we're seeing cord cutting on the cable side, a similar kind of over-the-top migration. And I'm sure eventually we will, whether we are or not. I'm not an expert, I couldn't tell you, but I'm sure eventually we will. And to me, what it means is we're more and more moving to a world where and I've seen cable executives say this already. The main product is broadband. It's not phone, it's not video. Broadband will increasingly become the main product because that's the one thing that, whatever the use case is, it supports it.
Next question.
Yeah, I have a question for Hank. I guess kind of a two-parter. The Rural Association, the National Telecommunications
Cooperative Association.
filed a petition at the FCC not long after AT&T filed its petition. And I don't represent rural co-ops, but one of the things that I had seen in their petition was a claim that one way to accelerate the continuing IP evolution, I mean, I think everybody seems to agree it's already happening and it's inevitable, but one of the ways to accelerate it was to confirm that all interconnection for the exchange of traffic is governed by the Act. And I guess my question there is, those aren't CLECs, those aren't new entrants, those are legacy carriers that seem to be making a similar point. And I wonder why. I guess maybe you can tell me what AT&T's position is on that, but why would they be making an issue of it? They are fellow incumbents, if you will. And maybe just to inform that point a little bit, when the FCC put out its Technology Task Force public notice this year, it mentioned some issues that kind of go to some of this network stuff. The FCC said in moving from TDM to VoIP, issues such as the number and physical points of interconnection, pricing, transit, numbering, number portability, service level agreements, quality of service, those are all things to look at. So I guess just for the benefit of folks here, because you have the benefit of being at the FCC, what are the issues there? And then finally, do these changes to IP, from AT&T's perspective, change any definitions under the Act?
So I'm in no position to sort of read the mind of the authors of the NTCA petition. I think that the transition does pose a particular problem for rural carriers that we all need to figure out for it to work, because the transition has to work everywhere. And that problem is, today, for what we call long distance. It's hard to believe we're still talking about long distance. It's not a real market anymore, but we still have this thing we call long distance. For long distance calls into or out of the rural carrier exchanges, that's a revenue flow for them today on the voice side. On the IP side, on the data side, where they're providing broadband service, it's not a revenue flow, it's a cost to them, because they have to buy transit out of their exchanges out to the internet. And so I think the rural carriers, one concern they have about the transition is they see that revenue flow going away, and they see a cost, an expense coming in its stead. And so they want to find a way to solve that. So I think that's one of the primary issues that they want to see worked out.
Hank, isn't that revenue going away anyway?
Sure, but people look at NPVs in our business. The larger question, I think the things you mentioned are all right. We have to figure out all of those things. Where should we interconnect? What should the terms be around interconnection? How should service providers compensate each other or not compensate each other? And so we need to do that. There's a lot of good work underway, by the way. The industry, cable providers, telephone companies, we are working in the context of, there's work going on at the SIP Forum, at the Alliance for Telecommunications Industry Solutions, to resolve some of these next generation interconnection issues. So, I think that work's going to proceed, and we are going to figure out answers to all of those questions. Certainly, I would be leery of, until the industry figures out what it thinks the answers are, regulators coming in and dictating what the answers should be to how many points of interconnection and things like that. Let's give the industry a little space to try to figure out the answers. If it turns out there's some market failure that happens and people don't interconnect, or they interconnect, they insist on, unreasonable terms, well, there may come a day when regulation is needed, but let's wait until we get a little further down the road, is our view, before we start saying let's regulate first. And then there's other issues you named, like numbering and that. I mean, those are incredibly important and incredibly complex issues that I myself very much care about and, work on both in the context of the North American Numbering Council and within AT&T. So I'd be happy to talk at length, but if I started now, I wouldn't finish.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes. Let's go there.
What kind of topics would you address as, I guess, the regulators talk about what would replace the Kingsbury commitment? What kind of issues would you be addressing? I don't care.
So, why don't I let somebody else go? Okay. I would say that today, what I would do if I were the regulator is I would start, we had again, I was back in the session where we talked about Kentucky broadband availability. I would start with the map. The FCC and NTIA have been steadily improving this national broadband map. And I would start with that map and I would say, show me all the places where there is broadband, according to this information. And I would say, oh, okay, so those places, I can assume I have service providers in those. I don't need to go to somebody and say, let's make a deal. You provide service here and I will give you something. I don't need to. They're already there. Instead, I would say, okay, now show me the places where it's not and figure out why. What is the barrier here? Is it adoption? Is it population density is too low? And then what are the options for solving it? To what extent does grant-based solutions work? We heard from this morning someone from a co-op here operating in Kentucky and Tennessee explaining how under BIP and BTOP they were able to get grants that let them widely deploy a fiber to the home network at a cost of $3,500 per home passed. And let me just tell you, the market will never pay for that. So if that's what we decide we want, then we have to say, okay, that's what it's going to cost. How are we going to raise that money and how are we going to fund it? And so we should have a very open discussion about that. Let's identify where we see a problem. Let's figure out what the problem is and then let's solve it. And I think it's a very practical approach. We're not going to have a grand thing like the Kingsbury commitment where, we say, the whole country, here's the one deal. That's not going to work in this day and age because the networks are too heterogeneous and there are too many different providers. So we're going to have to take it more at a micro level.
Next question. One more. Only two per customers.
Are there any markets that AT&T would like to exit? And by that I mean geographic markets that it's presently in?
I'm not aware of any.
Yeah, exactly. That's cruel. That is cruel. It was a VACO operator, I think, wasn't it?
That's what I heard.
6 hours. Any more questions? Yes, sir.
As we move from the circuit switch network to the IP networks and the wireless networks, we've all experienced quality of service issues. What are the companies doing to address quality of service, and should there be regulation of quality of service?
Randy, you want to talk about that?
We're dependent on the interconnection.
Not all at once. Okay.
We're all going to jump on this one.
So I would say from a wireless perspective, what we're doing is, really adding depth to cell coverage. And so it's adding more macro cells, but it's really moving aggressively into smaller cells and distributed antenna systems and Wi-Fi handoffs and things like that. So my expectation is that certainly from a wireless perspective, the quality is higher today than it was 3 or 4 years ago, and it'll be higher still a few years from now, assuming we continue to stay ahead of the spectrum gain. If we don't, if we fail to get enough spectrum out on a timely basis, then all bets will be off on that issue. Beyond that, I don't know if people have quality concerns with their voice over IP service or something like that. Maybe Randy has some experience with that.
Anybody else? Any more questions?
Well, I have one.
Okay.
And always, we've talked about wireless a lot, we've talked about mobility a lot, and often I hear people, when they talk about those issues, mobility, mobile is going to be the only place we are in the world in 20 years, that wired is going to be no more, it's all going to be wireless. In your crystal ball, do we really ever get to a world that it is only mobile, it is only wireless, or is it either or is it a both and question?
I think the idea that it's binary is wrong. Really, most of the distance of even wireless, the signal travels most of the distance on wires. It's really, ultimately, it's a game of how fast can you get the signal in the ground. And so I think we will need more and more robust wireline networks going forward, just as we will need more and more robust wireless networks. I think that nobody knows exactly what the business models are for those networks. So you're seeing things machine to machine. Where does that fit in? What's the future of subscription-based broadband as opposed to use-based broadband? I don't have a crystal ball for that stuff.
One more question here. Last one.
Hank, the information that you've provided about access line losses, it seems quite dire, and it seems to be a reality. But what I'm wondering is, does AT&T publish information about the extent to which that those access line losses from AT&T result in porting to AT&T wireless services, just to give maybe a little fuller perspective on the impact on AT&T as a company overall?
Oh, if you were a shareholder.
That's right. You put all you want.
I don't think we generally, the wireless carriers all look at the flow share between them. So, as far as I'm aware, all of our competitors in wireless are constantly, every week, looking to see, did I gain or lose against AT&T? Did I gain or lose against Verizon? Did I gain or lose against Sprint? Did I gain or lose against T-Mobile? I've never heard of anyone looking, how did I do as a company that provides both landline and wireless, how did those things net? Maybe that'll change now that, we are really starting to come to market with wireless products that are really more directed at the home. So you may not know that in a few markets, we've rolled out a wireless home phone and internet service. So maybe the people who are in that marketing group are going to start to track that. But I'm not aware that anybody traditionally has tracked that.
I'd particularly like to thank Jim Gant, the godfather of the telecommunications summits we've had, for doing it one more time. Michael Ramage for his great skill today and also in putting the program together over the last couple of months. I'd like to thank also our panel of Hank Hultquist, Randy Hollis, Bob Yaden, and thank you for attending. We're done.